Robert Kennedy was on the campaign trail in April 1968 and was heading for an event in Indianapolis, where he'd be speaking to a largely black crowd in a poor neighborhood. On the way, he learned that the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated in Memphis. He was also told that few, if any, of the people in the crowd would have heard the tragic news. The local police feared that violence would erupt once word of the assassination spread, and they told Kennedy that they could not protect him if that happened. So it would have been perfectly reasonable for Kennedy just to bypass the event. But is that what he did? Kennedy, instead, stood on the back of a flatbed truck, faced the crowd, and broke the news of King's assassination right away. He spoke for less than 5 minutes that day and gave what some consider to be among the best speeches in U.S. history. He said, "I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee." In recordings of the speech, gasps can be heard in the audience, along with an outcry of surprise and sadness. Kennedy spoke on to memorialize King by explaining that King had dedicated his life to love and justice. Kennedy then asked the crowd, what direction do we want to take as a country? Toward hate and anger, or toward the goal that Martin Luther King worked and died for, toward compassion and love? Then Kennedy did something quite unusual. Prior to this moment, he had rarely spoken publicly about his brother's assassination. But in addressing that largely African-American crowd in Indianapolis that day, he made very clear reference to it. He spoke to the people who might feel hate and anger and said, "For those of you who are black and are tempted to be filled with hatred and mistrust of the injustice of such an act against all white people, I would only say that I can also feel in my own heart the same kind of feeling. I had a member of my family killed. He was killed by a white man." Kennedy went on to call for unity regardless of race and called for people to say a prayer for MLK's family and for our country, a prayer for understanding and compassion. The crowd applauded and dispersed quietly without violence. Meanwhile, in more than 100 cities across the United States, riots erupted. What makes this an influential speech? And more broadly, what are the components of an effective speech, whether given at a political rally, a community fundraising event, a presentation at work, or even a dinner party? Imagine you decide to stand up for a cause that matters to you and give a speech at your local church. How could you craft something that moves the crowd toward a desired action? In this lecture, we're going to address these questions by drawing on the insights of both the ancient and the modern world. First, we'll go to the man who is generally considered to be the founder of rhetoric in the West, Aristotle. Then we'll discuss how Aristotle's ideas were elaborated on by the Roman orator Cicero. Finally, we'll end closer to our current time by reviewing Dale Carnegie's tips for effective speaking. Let's start with Aristotle, who believed that there were 3 tools or techniques available to a speaker trying to persuade her audience: ethos, logos, and pathos. The first technique a speaker uses is ethos. Ethos refers to the audience's perception of a speaker's character. A A speaker who generates perceptions of credibility and trust will be better able to convince the audience. This is, in fact, a focus on those agent characteristics that we talked about earlier in this course when I introduced the Attic model. Aristotle was arguing that the agent's characteristics matter, and that there are quite specific things that a speaker can say to convince the audience, I am worth listening to. If you recall from the lecture about impression management, research has shown that there are two characteristics that people naturally and quite quickly assess about others: competence and caring. The overlap with Aristotle here is fascinating, as he suggests that ethos requires, as part of a short list, a perception of intelligence and of goodwill to the audience. If we take intelligence for competence and goodwill for caring, there's quite a bit of consistency between the ideas from the ancient world and the modern world of empirical research. What did Aristotle mean by intelligence, and how did he suggest that you could make sure an audience sees you that way? Someone with intelligence, as Aristotle describes it, is a sensible person, one who holds common sense and is sufficiently knowledgeable to address the topic at hand. So let's say you're in a situation where you want to persuade your local church congregation to pitch in to help with a major community project. How can you stand up and propose this idea in such a way that your intelligence shines through? Well, it can be useful to mention your relevant experience in the congregation. Mention the specific accomplishments that you've witnessed in the past when the church came together and you, with them, volunteered and made great things happen. Go on to talk about how proud you've been to be part of those efforts. Without bragging about what you can do as a leader, you are convincing the audience that you know what you're talking about when it comes to church volunteer efforts, and that you've been an integral part of past success. Aristotle also discussed goodwill as a component of ethos. If you want to deliver a successful speech, then the audience needs to perceive that you are motivated not by self-interest, but by a genuine concern for the well-being of the audience. How do you cultivate that perception? Well, to convey goodwill, you might seem to be reluctant about something you're trying to convince your audience about. Note, for example, that you didn't believe something, just as the audience might not now, until you were confronted with overwhelming evidence. In his documentary, An Inconvenient Truth, Al Gore used this technique to describe the effect that overwhelming evidence of CO2 emissions had on his views about global warming. Whether you agree with his conclusions or not, if you watch the movie, you can see how effective perceptions of goodwill are in drawing listeners into the argument. On the other hand, I worry some that this approach to creating an impression of goodwill might be seen as disingenuous and may cross an ethical line. If you feign surprise about information that changed your mind, when the audience really knows your mind was already made up, then you could undermine your credibility and any chance of being influential going into the future. Non-fictional speeches are not fictional theater or made up. While we can learn from theater, we have to be careful about making things up, going too far in adopting techniques that could be perceived as manipulative. So far, we've been talking about Aristotle's first means of persuasion, ethos. To sum up, we can say that ethos is a means of persuasion, a technique that bolsters the speaker's perceived character. By conveying intelligence and goodwill, speakers are more likely to succeed in their attempt to influence. Now, let's discuss Aristotle's second technique for persuasion, logos. Logos relates to the argument itself and how it should be shaped to be most convincing. At the heart of every speech is a core argument, a claim with associated evidence that you're making to compel people to believe or act in a certain way. Aristotle noted, and this is still true today, that many arguments are not well constructed and contain logical fallacies. Fallacies are flaws in arguments that we should avoid if we wish to be influential speakers. So let's spend a few moments looking at a couple of common fallacies that speakers commit. One fallacy that Aristotle pointed out is equivocation. This is when someone uses a word that has multiple meanings and is not clear about the intended meaning. For example, when an employee who is often late to work is asked by her supervisor, "When did you get to work?" she might respond, "Some time ago." In her mind, she knows that "some time ago" refers to 15 minutes, but she's hoping that her boss will interpret this to mean much earlier. Or take an example of delivering a speech to a church congregation. The speaker might claim that he met the President of the United States who supports this work. Here, met might literally mean that he shook hands briefly with the President, and this work may refer to any type of community development. But by using vague words, the speaker implies a more personal connection took place, and that the President endorses this particular church project. In the case of the short conversation with the boss and the church speech, a speaker who uses equivocation may be trying to get away with a weak argument. But this is a dubious strategy that can undermine your effectiveness, particularly if an audience is listening carefully. Instead of using equivocation, it would be far better for you to carefully attend to logos. This involves thinking through the pieces of evidence that should convince the audience, then laying that argument out with a thoughtful selection of words and phrases. If you go this route, Aristotle would be pleased. Another fallacy is the ad hominem argument. This is when we base an argument on a characteristic of a person rather than on sound evidence and logic. We often see this fallacy in action with ad hominem attacks, in which speakers disparage the character of another person in an attempt to discredit his argument. In a famous example that shows U.S. politics has always been a rough sport, the campaign between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson in 1800 was hotly contested. It was actually a rematch of the 1796 election that Adams had won. During the campaign, supporters of Adams called Jefferson an uncivilized atheist and a tool for the godless French. He was also called a weakling and the son of a half-breed Indian squaw. Supporters of Jefferson called Adams a fool, a gross hypocrite, and an unprincipled oppressor who had a hermaphroditical character with neither the force and firmness of a man nor the gentleness and sensibility of a woman. There were other attacks in U.S. political history, further proof that negative campaigning is not a modern invention. For example, in the contest between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson in 1828, Quincy Adams was called a pimp, and Jackson's wife was dragged in the mud with some pretty mean labels as well. Considering how clearly vicious some of these attacks are, why do people use them? The answer is simple. Ad hominem attacks can work, even if they're not always logical. To begin, we should note that sometimes the attacks have some connection to valid political issues. For example, to call John Adams an oppressor could be relevant to his views about the appropriate range of central government authority. And to discuss Jefferson's connection to the French could be relevant to his likely foreign policy. To the extent that these issues are important to the campaign and the choice of how one might vote, then they are an important consideration. Problem with regard to logos arises when the labels are extended and exaggerated, and then move towards issues unrelated to the argument at hand, such as when Adams was called a fool and Jefferson a tool. These attacks are a blatant effort to rob the victim of ethos, and they can work if the audience does not take a critical approach to dissecting the argument to understand whether the claim is related at all to the argument at hand. As we've discussed in an earlier lecture, we can all be susceptible to social proof. If enough people can be enlisted to call your opponent a fool, a pimp, or a liar, then for some people it will become truth. And the result is that your opponent will lose at least some capacity to influence others. But even if fallacies are often used successfully in political debates, they are best considered a crutch when good arguments are in short supply. What these politicians should do, and I hope you will do as well, is focus on building logos with clear and logically consistent claims. If you have to resort to equivocation or ad hominem attacks, then maybe your position isn't that strong and you should reconsider it. Now that we've looked at ethos and logos, let's turn to the third and final technique addressed by Aristotle, pathos. Pathos refers to the emotions experienced by the audience during a speech. Aristotle was not endorsing arousing emotion in the audience just for the sake of doing so. His idea was that speakers should elicit emotions that are germane to the argument being made. The speaker's goal is to have an emotion present in the audience so that they will be more likely to understand your perspective, accept your claims, and act on your suggestions. This is often done quite effectively with the use of vivid language and a story, which helps put concrete images to the more abstract arguments being made. The type of emotion that should be elicited and how intense it is depends on the nature of the speaker's goals. Sometimes a mild emotion, a slight nervousness about the future, for example, is sufficient. If the speaker is trying to move people to action, then a more intense emotion might be needed. President Ronald Reagan has been labeled the great communicator, and his speeches offer wonderful examples of pathos. Here's just one example drawn from his fifth State of the Union address to the U.S. Congress in 1986. The American dream is a song of hope that rings through night winter air. Vivid, tender music that warms our hearts when the least among us aspire to the greatest things, to venture a daring enterprise, to unearth new beauty in music, literature, and art, to discover a new universe inside a tiny silicon chip or a single human cell. Clearly, Reagan is tapping into the power of pathos by using vivid, emotional language. Did he stop there? Of course not. To make this speech even more powerful, Reagan went on to tell the stories of specific young people who'd acted bravely to save their friends, who had created music and served the poor. As if concrete and vivid stories were not enough, Reagan had these people actually attend the speech and stand up to be recognized when he finished. While they were standing, so the audience could see their faces, Reagan would continue. Thank you. Thank you. You are heroes of our hearts. We look at you and know it's true. In this land of dreams fulfilled, where greater dreams may be imagined, nothing is impossible. No victory is beyond our reach. No glory will ever be too great. Given the vividness of the language and the concreteness, even the presence of the specific people that he acknowledged, it's easy to see why Reagan was known as the great communicator. And if you've seen any State of the Union address since 1986, this approach has become the norm. In starting this tradition of effective use of pathos, Reagan would have made Aristotle proud. Now that we've covered ethos, logos, and pathos, let's revisit Robert Kennedy's short speech in 1968. Kennedy's logos was clear and impeccable. He was in fact saying what many other leaders were saying around the country, that Martin Luther King lived and died for peace, and he would have wanted to see his vision of a united America come to pass, rather than have more violence. The way to carry on King's legacy would not be through bloodshed, but through peace and unity. Kennedy effectively employed pathos, too. In his voice, you could tell he felt loss and grief, and he didn't hide it. The members of the audience that day were in shock. They were confused, sad, and some angry. Kennedy did not shy away from acknowledging these emotions. In fact, he even showed his own sadness. In this way, Kennedy connected with the audience's emotions. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Kennedy referenced his personal experience to generate ethos. This was a man who had also lost someone dear to him. He had intelligence drawn from personal experience, and he'd showed goodwill toward the crowd by facing and not shying away from difficult news, and by acknowledging very real tension between blacks and whites. One thing that really sticks with me about this speech, from the very first time I heard it, is that no one else could have given that speech that night the way Kennedy did. Who he was as a person blended with what he felt and believed to create a powerfully moving experience for the listeners. To use Aristotle's terms, it was in the careful adoption of ethos, logos, and pathos that a brilliant speech was crafted. To continue our exploration of what makes for a great speech, let's move from the ancient Greeks forward in time, some, to ancient Rome, and the work of someone who's been called the best orator of all times, Cicero. Cicero joined the Roman Senate in 75 BC and argued there for many, many years. Let's review one of the most critical ideas that he offered, the 5 canons of persuasion: invention, arrangement, style, memory, and delivery. Invention. Cicero argued that you must prepare your speech by seeking out specific information and tools you need to persuade your audience on the specific topic of the day. You should do your research and think about the most compelling reasons for the audience to believe that your ideas are the best ones. Arrangement. This is putting together the structure of the argument. You should think about the flow of your argument, typically beginning with ethos to win the crowd over, proceeding to logos to establish the argument, and finally sealing the deal with pathos. Next is style, which you should carefully consider in order to produce the desired emotional reaction in your audience. According to Cicero, you should think about which emotion best serves your argument and use a style to elicit it. The podium-thumping, near-yelling staccato speech is great for pumping up an audience, but it won't work in most business conferences and certainly won't win any friends at a funeral. You should match the style to the event and your goals as a speaker. Then comes memory, speaking without having to refer to notes. You should know what you are talking about and focus your entire attention on the audience, not on notes or, today's big mistake, PowerPoint slides that might be showing behind you. And finally, there is delivery. This is where you practice to make sure that you are acting out your speech in a way that best conveys the message. Now, Aristotle had discussed issues of style and delivery, but Cicero advanced these ideas by offering very detailed suggestions that are still taught in rhetoric classes today. While some now might seem dated, like memorizing and acting out a speech, they can be quite impressive if used properly. Consider the impression of intelligence and competence created by actually giving a speech from memory and matching all of your gestures and body language to the words spoken. In his book, Thank You for Arguing, J. Heinrichs provides a helpful summary of Cicero's tips. Heinrichs suggests using language that the audience understands, being clear, being vivid, following local conventions, and having a little ornament, but not too much. This means that you should adapt your words to the audience, and while not abandoning your own style or accent, you should find ways to connect with the people you're talking to. Remember our example of convincing your local congregation to support a community project? Imagine that you win over your local congregation and are now giving a speech in another place. Imagine you move from a northern church to the southern United States. In such a case, sprinkling additional polite terms into your speech and slowing down the pace of your words might allow you to fit in better and would make you likely more persuasive. Of course, you can take this too far. If you travel from your hometown in Boston to give a talk in Oxford, Mississippi, home of Ole Miss, you probably should not try to use phrases like y'all and down yonder. This would take you from trying to fit in to acting like an idiot by being inauthentic. Despite your best intentions, it might even be seen as patronizing. What could you do in this circumstance? Well, to honor the culture and traditions of Ole Miss without pretending you're part of it, you should not mimic the language, but you could mention some things related to what locals care about. You might mention how excited you are to walk through the magnolia and oak trees in the Grove. The Grove is a beautiful tree-lined area that is central to campus, both physically and spiritually, as it's considered by some to be the greatest tailgating spot in all of college football. Together, Aristotle and Cicero provide a good overview of the classic views of argument and influence. While these ideas predate the theory and research we've discussed thus far by 2,000 years, it's amazing to me how well they've stood the test of time. Despite the monumental changes in how we communicate, the suggestions of Aristotle and Cicero are still useful. But what do more modern speech makers offer as advice for how to give an influential speech? Let's briefly return to Dale Carnegie, author of the classic bestseller, How to Win Friends and Influence People. We have talked about Carnegie's 6 tips for getting people to like you in the last lecture. In his book, Carnegie also offers 3 fundamental principles for handling people, and these principles can be adopted to speech making. His short list is: first, don't criticize, condemn, or complain. Second, give honest and sincere appreciation. Third, arouse in the other person an eager want. In giving a speech, these 3 principles complement and add to the ideas of Aristotle and Cicero. To start, they reinforce the concern for ethos by asking you to focus on positives, showing goodwill. And of course, if you are giving honest appreciation, acknowledging your audience for their good work, then they will recognize your intelligence as well as your goodwill. How do we arouse an eager want, which means connecting with people and spurring them to action? This is where Carnegie reinforces and perhaps even adds to the ideas from the ancient world. The key here is to talk about something that you have genuine passion about. I'm assuming here that you have some choice in topic. But even if you don't, you should try to connect your topic with things that matter to you. Why? Well, it's nearly impossible to get others to feel passion if you don't feel it yourself. And trying to act out being passionate is best left to the professionals. So instead of acting, you should craft a speech that you can talk about because you know and you care about the topic. And if you do that, the audience will want to listen, and they'll be more likely to be persuaded. In this lecture, we have discussed Aristotle, Cicero, and now Carnegie, and along the way given you quite a few suggestions for preparing and delivering an influential speech. The speeches that you give do not have to be national addresses to benefit from these ideas. Pep talks you give your family, presentations at work, short speeches to local charity clubs. They can all be strengthened by applying the advice passed down from the ancient Greeks and Romans. With that in mind, let me suggest two things to try from this lecture. First, watch a political speech. Look for the signs of ethos, logos, and pathos. A good speech will show signs of each. If the speech falls flat, think about what was missing. Did the speaker forget to connect and establish credibility with the audience via ethos? Or were the arguments hard to follow, a sign of poorly developed logos? Finally, perhaps the emotional tone of the speaker didn't match the speech or the desired action. If so, that's a failure in pathos. Second, try drafting your own speech. Consider a topic of importance to you. Identify a time and place where you will be given the floor to speak your mind. Then, follow the tips here. Now, you need to know what your goal is, what you want people to do, and what the audience already knows and feels. With that information, you can invent and arrange the argument. Then, take the time to practice, get some feedback, commit it to memory. And then, how did you do with that delivery? Remember, practice and feedback. You'll get better. In the next lecture, we will leave speeches and head for the negotiating table. We'll discuss things that you can do to be convincing when you're sitting across the table from someone, looking in their eyes and trying to figure out the best way to close a deal.